Welcome to the Explainer. If you're a student in Pakistan looking at a postgraduate degree, or honestly, if you're just fascinated by massive bureaucratic shakeups, you're going to want to listen closely to this one. The Higher Education Commission, the HEC, is literally tearing up the rulebook for MPhil and PhD admissions. It's a massive structural shift, and it's sending ripples through universities right as we speak.
Okay, let's dive into this and lay out our roadmap. First, we'll look at the 2026 admission shift itself. Then, we'll meet the new mandatory HEC exam, explore its international connection to the GRE. And finally, we'll weigh the pros, cons, and some of those burning questions people are asking.
So, Part 1. The 2026 admission shift and the new HEC policy. The breaking news here is that the HEC is officially tossing out the old 2023 postgraduate admission policy. If you remember the old system, it was, well, incredibly fragmented and honestly pretty exhausting. If you wanted a PhD, you'd take a bespoke test at University A. If you didn't pass their interview, you'd have to start all over at University B, with a new fee and a completely new test. But this new system, it replaces all that chaos. Universities can't dictate their own initial entry criteria anymore. Instead, a single centralized test becomes your starting point for everything. To be super clear about what's actually being replaced here, we need to talk about the 700 and 800 level tests. In academia, the 700 level means the specific coursework exams for MPhil admissions, and the 800 level is for PhD admissions. The big takeaway? Institutions are now legally barred from giving their own bespoke 700 and 800 level entry exams. The HEC is stepping right in to standardize the gateway to these high-level research degrees across the board. All right, moving on to Section 2. Let's meet the mandatory HEC, the HEC's new aptitude test.
So if universities aren't giving the test, who is? Well, it's the HEC's own education testing service. And this brilliantly illustrates how it works because thankfully, it is not a one-size-fits-all situation. The HEC is broken down into 4 distinct categories based on your background. HEC 1 is for engineering, computer science, and math, so it leans heavily into physics and math logic. HEC 2 caters to management. HEC 3 is designed for arts, social sciences, and law, and finally HEC 4 is specifically for medical and allied health fields, focusing on biology and chemistry. Which makes total sense, right? You wouldn't want to evaluate a doctor and a software engineer on the exact same academic parameters.
But listen, no matter which HEC category you fall into, there is one universal baseline: 50. You absolutely must score at least 50 marks on this exam. That is the bare minimum. If you score a 49, the door is closed. 50 is the hard baseline just to be considered eligible for an MPhil or PhD program.
But hey, here's a massive silver lining for you. Once you actually hit that 50-mark threshold, your score is valid for 2 solid years. During that time, you can use that one single score to apply to multiple local universities, international programs, and even various scholarships. It is a huge game changer when it comes to saving time and application fees. You do need to understand what this test really represents, though. One of the sources we looked at for this explainer perfectly described it as a 2-step verification pass for your higher education. Passing the HEC doesn't magically guarantee you an admission letter. It just gives you that verification card. It gives you the right to apply. You still have to prove yourself to whichever university you're targeting.
Let's just quickly walk through exactly how this new admission pipeline flows so you can visualize it. Step 1, you register for and take your specific HAT exam. Step 2, you score 50 marks or higher. Step 3, armed with that valid score, you apply to the universities you want. And finally, Step 4, the secondary evaluation. This is where universities do their own thing. Rigorous interviews, looking at your past merit marks, assessing your research proposals, all of that. Ultimately, the university still makes the final call on letting you in. Let's jump to Section 3. The GRE connection and the international roots of all this. To really get why the new HEC looks the way it does, we have to look at its inspiration, the GRE, or Graduate Record Examination. Historically, this is an international test owned by the US and Canada ETS, required for North American admissions, especially business and law. It's famous for being an incredibly grueling exam that clocks in at about 3 hours and 45 minutes. So yeah, you'd need to bring snacks and a whole lot of stamina for that one.
The GRE is famously split into 3 core components. You've got verbal reasoning, which tests high-level vocabulary and reading. Then quantitative reasoning, which is basically advanced math. And third, analytical reasoning. Now, this part isn't just multiple choice. It often requires written case studies, where you have to literally write out a solution to a complex legal or business problem.
The HEC's new hat is essentially aiming to replicate this really rigorous style of cognitive assessment. But there's a huge reason why Pakistan needed its own localized version. The international GRE comes with a pretty serious sticker shock. It's currently around 205 USD. For a lot of students in Pakistan, that financial barrier is just way too high. So by creating a localized GRE-style exam, the HEC is trying to provide that same rigorous, standardized benchmark, but without the crippling international fees.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this all builds up. We're looking at the pros, cons, and the big questions surrounding this shift.
Obviously, any structural change this massive is going to spark some intense debate. Now, the rationale from the HEC is honestly quite strong. For starters, it brings much-needed standardization and transparency across all these different higher education institutions. It also saves students a ton of time and money, like we talked about. But maybe the biggest thing, it acts as an impartial filter. In the past, some private universities kind of treated entry tests as just a money-making activity, right? While public universities often faced immense external pressure to force certain admissions through. Having a mandatory centralized test curbs those biases and establishes a real national benchmark. But on the flip side, there's a very vocal counter-narrative from academics, and it really centers around this one fundamental clash: a standardized filter versus true aptitude. Critics point out that, sure, a test provides a neat, tidy little numerical benchmark, but does it capture a candidate's holistic cognitive ability? Does it show true research acumen? A lot of people are asking if a multiple-choice quantitative exam can genuinely reflect how innovative or brilliant a researcher someone might actually be.
One of the sources for this explainer actually drew a really fascinating analogy to highlight this point. Think about a Montessori school. In a Montessori environment, kids aren't handed strict numerical grades. Instead, the whole focus is on evaluating their cognitive growth, their curiosity, their overall development. Some academics are arguing that at the very highest levels of education, we're talking the PhD level here, we should be leaning into a holistic approach like that, rather than boiling a scholar's intellect down to a rigid, standardized score.
And that leaves us with a pretty profound thought to ponder as Pakistan's higher education landscape goes through this transformation. As the HAT becomes the mandatory gateway for 2026, we really have to ask, can a standardized test truly measure research acumen at the absolute highest levels of academia? Or is it simply a necessary bureaucratic filter in a system that's, well, imperfect? It's a massive question that the academic world is going to be wrestling with for years to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer to unpack it all.